They believed they were erasing her. When 72-year-old Evelyn stood on the border of her family property, watching the heavy steel claws of bulldozers tear into the earth, she looked like a woman who had finally been defeated. But what her children, and the powerful executives who bought them, did not know was that the ancient, tarnished copper seed vault she clutched to her chest was not a relic of a forgotten past. It was a fuse. Inside this worn-out metal box, covered in hand-carved ivy leaves, lay a secret so devastating that in exactly 6 weeks, it would reduce a multi-billion-dollar agricultural empire to ash and bring the very children who abandoned her to their knees, begging for her mercy. If you want to make sure you don't miss our next chapter together, click that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is incredibly close to my heart, and I can't wait to share it with you. The air in Greenvale was usually sweet, heavy with the sharp, clean scent of rosemary and the honeyed warmth of blooming chamomile. Today, it tasted of diesel exhaust and burnt rubber. The yellow paint of the excavators was bright, aggressively clinical against the soft, mossy greens of the valley. Evelyn stood perfectly still. Her boots, worn at the heels but polished, sank slightly into the damp earth. In her hands, she held the copper box. Its surface was cold, biting into her palms through her thin, knitted sweater. She could feel the intricate ridges of the ivy engraving, each leaf pressed into the metal by her grandmother Beatrice over half a century ago. Machine roared. A metal jaw bit the earth. With every shuddering rumble of the engines, another piece of her history was pulverized. A massive steel blade pushed forward, snapping the thick, woody stems of the old lavender bushes. These weren't just plants. They were memories. She had planted them with Beatrice when she was only a child, her small hands learning the precise depth a seed needed to survive the winter. Now, the scent of crushed purple flowers rose up in a desperate, final wave, mixing with the choking gray dust of the demolishing house. The yellow paint of the machinery seemed to mock her silence. "You need to listen. You're just making this harder on yourself." The voice was flat, sterile. It belonged to David, her eldest son. He was 48, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in the mud of the clearing. He held a sleek leather folder, the crisp white pages of the Greenvale Agrosystems contract reflecting the harsh autumn sun like a mirror. He wouldn't look at her face. Instead, his eyes kept doting to the copper box she held, his lip curling with a faint, habitual flicker of irritation. To him, that box was just more of her useless junk. "This for your own good, Mom," David continued, his fingers tapping impatiently against the leather folder as he adjusted his glasses. "The taxes on this land were eating your pension alive. Greenvale Agrosystems offered a generous package, more than this old place is worth. We've already secured a room for you at the Oak Creek Care Facility. It has 24-hour staff. You won't have to worry about cooking, or the garden, or any of this. You need to be realistic. At 72, you simply can't manage this anymore." And did not answer. The silence between them grew heavy, punctuated only by the screech of metal tearing through the old porch beams of her home. She looked at David, really looked at him. She saw the lines of greed around his mouth, the nervous twitch in his fingers, the utter absence of any shared memory. This was the boy she had stayed up with through countless fevers, the one she had sacrificed her own career and savings to put through college. Now, he was treating her like an old piece of furniture that needed to be moved to make room for a new development. A cold, deep anger rising in her chest, but she kept it locked down. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. She would not scream, and she would not beg. Her children, David, Clara, and Mark, had spent years whispering behind her back, treating her like the family shame, the eccentric old botanist who lived in the shadow of a decades-old town scandal. They believed Arthur Pendelton's lies. Everyone did. To them, she was the woman who had tried to poison the valley out of professional jealousy. Adjusted her grip on the copper box. The weight of it felt solid, an anchor in the middle of the chaos. She turned her back on her son. She did not sign the paper. She did not say a single word of goodbye. With her chin held high and her shoulders straight, Evelyn turned away from the roaring machines, away from her son's frustrated sighs, and walked steadily toward the dark, quiet sanctuary of the forest. Behind her, she heard David call her name, his voice sharp with annoyance, but she didn't look back. The trees welcomed her with their silent, cool shadows. Places are built to withstand the passage of time, while others are built to hide it. For over 70 years, the old stone greenhouse had waited at the edge of the wild forest, a forgotten sentinel of a family's stolen legacy. It stood untouched by the greed of her children, resting in a silence that felt almost holy. The deeper Evelyn walked into the woods, the more the mechanical roar of the bulldozers faded. It died slowly. First, a low vibration in the soles of her boots, then a distant, metallic hum. Finally, nothing. Only the soft, rhythmic crunch of damp pine needles beneath her feet remained. The forest was thick here. Towering white pines and ancient, moss-draped oaks reached up to choke out the harsh afternoon sun, casting the forest floor in cool, emerald shadows. The air grew heavy and damp. It smelled of wet clay, rotting leaves, and wild, undisturbed fern. It was the scent of safety. With every step away from the highway, the tight knot of anger in her chest began to loosen, replaced by a hollow, aching exhaustion. She was alone, truly alone. Then she saw it. Nestled directly into the rocky slope of the hillside was the greenhouse. My father had raised those stone walls with his own hands in the late 1930s, using gray fieldstone dragged from the nearby riverbed. The structure was weathered, half swallowed by aggressive wild briars and thick ivy, but it stood firm. The concrete foundation remained unyielding. Unlike the house her children had just sold for a quick profit, this place refused to crumble. Overhead, a dome of rusted iron ribs held hundreds of small glass panels. Most of them were spider-webbed with cracks, coated in a thick, velvet layer of green moss, but they had survived the decades of storms. The heavy oak door. It groaned. The rusted iron hinges protested violently, shedding flakes of orange dust as she forced her way inside. A wave of cool, stagnant air rushed out to meet her. It smelled of dried chamomile, old paper, and the ghost of soil that had long since dried to dust. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the wind. A sudden gust shook the pine trees outside, causing the cracked glass panels overhead to rattle and creak in their iron frames. A cold draft swept across her neck. Walked to the center of the room, where a heavy timber workbench sat under a solitary shaft of sunlight. A thick layer of gray dust coated the wood like winter frost. With a gloved hand, she swept a section of the timber clear, sending a cloud of dancing dust motes spinning into the golden light. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small box of matches, then located an old, glass-bodied kerosene lamp resting on a shelf nearby. Her fingers, usually so steady during her delicate botanical work, were trembling now. The adrenaline of the confrontation with David was finally fading, leaving behind a cold, physical weakness that settled deep in her bones. She struck a match. The small flame hissed, casting a sudden dancing shadow against the gray stone walls. She touched the fire to the wick. A warm, amber glow bloomed, slowly pushing back the heavy shadows in the corners of the room. The sharp, nostalgic scent of burning kerosene filled the damp air. It was a comforting smell, a familiar, grounding presence. Down on an old wooden stool, her knees aching. Carefully, she placed the copper seed box on the clean patch of the workbench, directly under the lamp's warm light. It was the only tangible thing she had left in the world. Everything else, her clothes, her books, her grandmother's original botanical sketches, had been packed into that donation truck by David's hired men, treated as worthless clutter. This box was her grandmother Beatrice's most prized possession. She traced the cold, tarnished metal with her bare thumb. The heavy copper had turned a deep, dark brown over the decades, with patches of pale green oxidation hiding in the crevices of the engraved ivy. She had seen this box 1,000 times on Beatrice's vanity. She had played with it as a child, trying to pry it open, but it had always been locked tight. No keyhole existed, no latch was visible. The wind howled outside, a sharp gust making the old glass roof creak in protest. Evelyn turned the box over in her hands, her heart beginning to beat with a strange, nervous rhythm. Closer. In the warm, flickering amber light of the lamp, she noticed something different. On the narrow side panel, nestled deep within the tangled, chaotic pattern of the engraved ivy vines, was a tiny, raised leaf. It wasn't an ivy leaf, it was a fern. It was a tiny, delicate fern frond, no larger than a fingernail, carved with exquisite, hidden detail. Her breath caught in her throat. She had held this box for 50 years, yet she had never noticed this single, discordant detail. A roguish leaf in a sea of ivy. It was a button. A secret lock waiting for the right hand at the darkest hour. It does not make a sound when it hides, but when it is finally released, it speaks with the sharp snap of a rusted spring. Evelyn pressed her thumb against the tiny raised fern leaf. At first, nothing happened. The aged metal resisted her touch. 35 years of dirt, moisture, and stubborn silence fought against her. She braced her hands against the worn wood of the workbench, leaned her weight forward, and pushed with everything she had left. Click. It was a dull, heavy sound that echoed sharply against the cold stone walls of the greenhouse. A draft of cold air seemed to pass through the room, making the kerosene flame flicker wildly. The bottom of the copper box did not just pop open, it dropped. A hidden panel swung downward on a pair of miniature, perfectly concealed brass hinges that had been oiled decades ago. Evelyn gasped. Her hands instinctively caught the box as a dense stack of yellowed, fragile paper and 3 thick, cream-colored envelopes tumbled out onto the clean patch of the workbench, there in the warm, flickering amber light. The paper was old. Its edges were slightly frayed and darkened by time, but the documents themselves were perfectly dry, preserved by the airtight seal of the copper chamber. A faint, sweet scent of dried lavender and ancient parchment rose from the pile, momentarily masking the sharp sting of the kerosene. These pages had not seen the light of day since the autumn of 1991. Evelyn reached out. Her fingers hovered over the fragile sheets, but she couldn't bring herself to touch them yet, and shook so violently that her knuckles went white. She closed her eyes, took a ragged breath, and picked up the first sheet of paper. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the elegant, highly disciplined, sloping script of her grandmother, Beatrice. The faded black ink was still clear, the lines precise and steady, though the hand that had held the pen had been fragile even then. At the top of the page, a date was written in the upper corner, September 12th, 1991. Evelyn's breath hitched in her dry throat. The year. The exact, devastating year everything she had built collapsed into ash. The year she became a pariah in the town of Greenvale. She began to read, her eyes tracking the faded ink. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began. "If you are reading these words, it means the worst has happened, and you have finally returned to the sanctuary. It means I am gone, and the weight of the world has broken you, just as he intended. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry. I am sorry for my silence. I am sorry that I had to let you carry the shame of a crime you did not commit." His heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She leaned closer to the lamp, the paper rattling in her trembling hand as she read the next paragraph. "You must know the truth, Evelyn. You did not fail. You did not ruin the crops of Greenvale. It was Arthur. Arthur Pendelton knew exactly what you had created. He knew your soil cure was the only thing that could save the valley, and he knew he could never replicate your genius on his own. He did not just steal your formulas, he systematically planned your destruction to ensure you could never challenge his patent. The local inspectors. He fabricated the soil tests that blamed your laboratory. He made sure the town saw you as a threat so they would never listen to your defense. Evelyn stopped. She couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The cold stone floor of the greenhouse felt miles away. For 35 years, she had carried a suffocating, invisible weight. She had lived as an exile in her own hometown, a woman whispered about in grocery store aisles, a mother whose own children looked at her with a mixture of pity and silent, burning embarrassment. Spent decades of sleepless nights wondering if she had made a mistake in her calculations. She had questioned her own mind. She had wondered if her science had been flawed, if she was somehow responsible for the blight that ruined her family and left her in bitter poverty. But she was innocent. She was completely, utterly innocent. A sudden, sharp sob broke from her throat, tearing through the quiet dampness of the greenhouse. It was a raw, primal sound, born of 3 decades of suppressed agony. And then, the tears came, hot and heavy, spilling over her eyelashes and tracing the deep, weathered lines of her cheeks. They splashed onto the ancient, yellowed pages before her, blurring the black ink of Beatrice's elegant script. She did not try to wipe them away. She let them flow. They washed over her hands, hot and cleansing, carrying away the decades of unearned shame, of quiet humiliation, of a guilt she should have never had to carry. In the dim, warm light of the old greenhouse, Evelyn wept for the young woman she had been, and for the truth that had finally, patiently, come to find her. Wounds do not bleed. They simply freeze you in the exact moment your life was stolen. As Evelyn stared at the faded ink of Beatrice's letter, the cold stone walls of the greenhouse melted away, replaced by the brilliant, tragic warmth of the spring of 1991. Greenvale was dying back then. A devastating, silent plague of downy mildew was sweeping through the valley, turning the once lush emerald grapevines into black, shriveled rot. The air tasted of despair. Farmers were on the verge of losing everything, their families facing immediate ruin. 37 years old and full of fierce, stubborn hope, was the only one who held the key to their salvation. She had spent 3 years in her small, independent laboratory, working until her eyes burned under the harsh, fluorescent lights. She was close. She knew she was. She spent her nights mixing organic compounds, studying plant pathology, and refusing to give up on the soil her family had tended for generations. And then she found it. She called it Soil Shield, a revolutionary, entirely organic compound that didn't just kill the mildew. It rebuilt the plant's natural immunity from the roots up. Masterpiece of biological science. She remembered the pure, dizzying joy of that discovery. She remembered running home to tell her husband, their laughter filling their modest kitchen. They believed they were going to save the town. But she was not alone in that lab. Arthur Pendelton was her assistant. He was 25, handsome, smooth-talking, and utterly devoid of genuine scientific talent. He was the kind of man who smiled too easily and listened too closely. Evelyn, naive in her passion for the work, trusted him. She treated him like a partner, showed him her journals, her test tubes, her delicate chemical balances. She did not see the envy festering behind his polite, deferential smile. Then, in a single weekend, he vanished, and with him went her life's work. Arthur did not just take her notebooks, he took her future. Within days, he filed a patent for Soil Shield under his own name, secure in the knowledge that a young woman with no corporate backing could never afford the astronomical legal fees to fight him. Overnight, Pendelton Laboratories was born, backed by wealthy investors who saw Arthur as a young, brilliant savior. Arthur was clever. He knew patenting her formula wasn't enough. He had to ensure Evelyn could never speak the truth. He had to destroy her credibility so thoroughly that any accusation she made would sound like the bitter ramblings of a madwoman. The frame-up was brutal. One morning, the local environmental inspectors arrived at Evelyn's laboratory. Acting on an anonymous tip, they dug up the soil directly behind her greenhouse. They found barrels of highly toxic, banned agricultural chemicals buried in the ground. They found her forged signature on illegal disposal manifests. All Arthur's doing. He had paid off the inspectors. He had placed the chemicals there. Arthur stood before the town council and wept tears of false concern. He told the community that Evelyn, consumed by professional jealousy over his independent discovery, had tried to poison the water table to ruin the crops and discredit him. The town believed him instantly. Why wouldn't they? Arthur was the wealthy, charismatic young man with a patented cure in his hand. Evelyn was just a quiet local woman with dirt under her fingernails. Overnight, her world collapsed. Began. Friends she had known since childhood crossed the street to avoid her. Local businesses refused to sell to her. Bricks were thrown through her laboratory windows, followed by hateful letters calling her a poisoner. But the cruelest blow did not fall on her alone. Her husband, a quiet, gentle man who loved her fiercely, couldn't bear the weight of the disgrace. He watched the town ruin his wife's spirit. He saw his own small carpentry business collapse as clients boycotted him. He spent his nights pacing their small home, his heart physically breaking under the relentless, choking pressure. After morning, his heart simply gave out. He died at 39. He died of a broken heart, leaving Evelyn completely alone in a world that had branded her a monster. For 35 years, she had lived in the shadow of that lie, carrying the silent, crushing weight of a tragedy she did not cause. And now, holding the evidence of his crimes in her hands, she looked back at the ruins of her life and felt a cold, quiet fire ignite in her soul. Silence is not always a sign of surrender. Sometimes it is a shadow forged in the dark to protect the people we love most. And let the first letter rest on her lap, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the paper. Her tears had slowed, leaving her skin tight and cold in the damp draft of the greenhouse. She reached out to the dusty workbench and picked up the second cream-colored envelope. This one was heavier. It felt thick, almost substantial in her hand. She broke the old, brittle wax seal. A faint, nostalgic scent of dried lavender flared briefly, a sweet, fragile memory of her grandmother's kitchen. She unfolded the page, her eyes catching the trembling, hurried lines of Beatrice's handwriting, written on the same night in September of 1991. But the ink was darker, pressed into the paper with a desperate, urgent force. "My dearest Evelyn," Beatrice wrote, "I know you have spent these past weeks hating the silence of this house. I know you have looked at me and wondered why I did not march into the town square, why I did not shout your innocence to the heavens. You thought I had given up on you. You thought I believed his lies. Oh, my darling, if only you knew the monster we were fighting." The words seemed to chill the very air in the stone room. Leaned closer to the amber glow of the kerosene lamp, her breath shallow. "It was a rainy Tuesday night," the letter continued, "a week after the inspectors ruined your laboratory. Arthur Pendelton came to my door. He did not look like the polite, quiet boy who used to clean your test tubes. He wore a heavy wool coat, and his eyes were cold. Dead. He knew I had been talking to the port authorities. He knew I was searching for the original cargo manifests of the toxic chemicals they found buried on your land." Evelyn could almost hear the rain drumming against the tin roof in 1991, feel her grandmother's terror. "He sat in my kitchen, drank my tea, and smiled. He told me calmly that if I brought those papers to the sheriff, your brothers, my sons, Peter and Michael, would pay the price. He was already incredibly powerful, Evelyn. He had the backing of corrupt lawyers and greedy politicians who had invested in his new company. He told me he had already prepared a false file accusing your brothers of burning down the central grain warehouses, the big fire that happened 2 months ago. The evidence was forged, but with Arthur's wealth, it would have been ironclad. Gone to prison for life." The paper rattled in Evelyn's hand. "He looked at me over his teacup," Beatrice wrote, and said, "I can destroy your entire family, old woman, or you can be quiet and let Evelyn carry this temporary shame. She will survive, But your boys will not survive prison. My heart broke in that kitchen, Evelyn. I had to choose between your reputation and your brothers' lives. I chose their survival. I hated myself for it. I still do, every single day. Evelyn closed her eyes. A profound wave of warmth and understanding washed over her. A deep, ancestral love stood now. Her grandmother hadn't abandoned her. She hadn't been a coward. She had carried the agonizing weight of that secret to her grave, sacrificing her own peace to keep her family alive. She opened her eyes and read the final lines of the letter. I took your original journals, the ones Arthur didn't manage to steal, and I hid them. My husband carved the secret fern leaf latch on this copper seed box, burying the truth beneath a pattern of ordinary ivy. I hid the truth where no one would think to look. I saved this for the day when you have nothing left but this truth. The world has stripped you of everything else, and you are standing in the dark. That is when you must open this box. Use it, Evelyn. Use it not for simple revenge, but as a shield. Let it protect you when you have no other protector left. I love you. I have always loved you. Evelyn sat in the quiet of the greenhouse, the letter clutched tightly against her chest. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the cracked glass panels above. But inside her, the storm had ceased. The sorrow was gone, washed away by the truth. In its place was a cold, indestructible resolve. 72 years old, evicted, and standing in the dark with nothing left to her name. But she had the shield. Her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she stared into the warm, steady flame of the lamp. The time for hiding was over. She was ready to fight. An empire built on a stolen lie can only stand as long as the soil remains quiet. High above the valley of Greenvale, on the top floor of Pendelton Laboratories, the air was cold, sterile. It tasted of expensive air conditioning and metallic fear. Arthur Pendelton stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, his hands clasped. 25, he was still a highly handsome, commanding man. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his bespoke Italian suit pristine, his posture rigid. But beneath the polished wool, his shoulders were tense. His silk tie felt like a noose. Behind him, on the massive mahogany conference table, lay a heavy silver tray. On it rested a single bunch of grapes, plucked from his flagship vineyard just that morning. They were black, shriveled, covered in a wet, fuzzy gray rot that smelled faintly of vinegar and decay. The soil was fighting back. 35 years, Arthur's patented soil shield had been the undisputed king of agricultural chemistry. It had made him a billionaire. It had bought him political influence, luxurious estates, and a reputation as a visionary savior of the valley. But the formula was incomplete. He had stolen it in a hurry in 1991, snatching Evelyn's notebooks before she could finish her long-term stability trials. He had rushed it to market to beat her to the patent office, ignoring her written warnings about soil depletion and chemical resistance. Now, the bill was due. The downy mildew had mutated. The barrier that had suppressed the blight for 3 decades had suddenly, catastrophically shattered. The new strain was aggressive. It was a super blight, spreading through the root systems of Greenvale like a subterranean wildfire. On his wall-mounted monitors, the stock tickers danced in terrifying, bleeding red numbers. Pendelton Laboratories, minus 4.2%, minus 6.8%, minus 9.1%. The rumors were already beginning to leak. 2 major estate owners had called his private line that morning, their voices shaking with fury. Their entire harvest was turning to ash in a matter of days. Chemical treatments they bought from Pendelton were only making the rot spread faster. "Falsify the laboratory results," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he stared out over the valley. He turned to face his chief of research, a young scientist who was pale with terror, clutching an iPad to his chest like a shield. "Sir," the researcher stammered, The board of directors is already demanding the quarterly crop health reports. The international investors, they are hearing rumors from the local growers. We cannot hide a crop failure of this scale. The data is clear. Oil is rejecting the compound. "I don't care what you have to do," Arthur roared, his face flushing a deep, angry purple as he slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, rattling the silver tray. "Doctor the satellite imagery. Tell them it's a localized weather anomaly. Tell them it is an isolated irrigation error. Lie to them. Buy me some time." The researcher flinched, nodding quickly before scurrying out of the boardroom like a frightened mouse. Arthur sank into his leather chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rubbed his temples. He was a billionaire, a man who had successfully bought judges, inspectors, and crushed the brilliant woman who had actually created his empire. Yet, as he looked at the black, rotting grapes on the silver tray, he felt a cold, hollow dread settling in his stomach. The clock was ticking. 7 days. In exactly 1 week, the annual harvest inspection would begin. The state agricultural inspectors, along with the most prominent international wine buyers, would arrive in Greenvale. They would walk the fields. They would touch the vines. They would test the soil. There was no amount of money, no amount of political influence, and no PR campaign to hide miles of blackened, rotting vineyards. The truth would be exposed to the entire world. The Pendelton empire would collapse like a house of cards, and Arthur would face ruin and criminal fraud charges before the month was out. He was vulnerable. For the first time in 35 years, the great Arthur Pendelton was utterly powerless against the very earth he had poisoned. A thief only copies the notes. He never understands the rhythm of the soil. Arthur Pendelton paced his steel and glass prison, suffocating in his own panic. Evelyn sat in the quiet dampness of the stone greenhouse, surrounded by the calm, unchanging laws of nature. On her workbench, a vintage brass microscope stood beside several glass petri dishes. She had spent the afternoon collecting samples of the black, rotting grape leaves from the wild vines that climbed the forest edge. The blight had reached the woods. It was the same aggressive, mutated superfungus that was currently eating Arthur's empire from the inside out, turning the rich valleys of Greenvale to ash. Adjusted the focus on her microscope. Her hand was steady now. The trembling was gone, replaced by the cool, analytical focus of a true scientist. Through the lens, the mutated downy mildew looked like a forest of black, fuzzy needles, aggressively piercing the cellular walls of the grape leaf. It was beautiful in its destructive efficiency. It was a pathogen designed to survive anything Arthur's chemical treatments could throw at it. She turned to Beatrice's lab journals, her fingers gently turning the fragile, yellowed pages. She compared her grandmother's original chemical structures, patent Arthur had filed 35 years ago. She looked, she calculated, and then she understood. A cold, quiet smile touched her lips. Arthur had been too impatient. In his desperate greed to beat her to the patent office in 1991, he had stolen her research before she could finish her final phase of testing. He had taken her raw, unstable compound, patented it, and sold it to the world as a finished product. He didn't know, and could never have understood, that the base formula was missing its crucial stabilizing agent. Without that agent, the compound was a temporary fix, ticking time bomb. Over 3 decades of consistent use, the fungus had slowly but surely adapted, learning to feed on the very chemicals designed to kill it. The missing stabilizer was an organic extract from the root of a rare, forest-dwelling orchid, an endemic species that grew only in the deep, undisturbed shade of the Greenvale woods. The Cypripedium sylvestre. Evelyn knew the irony was absolute. Arthur had cleared those very woods to build his massive chemical factories. In his arrogance, he had paved over the only plant in the world that could keep his stolen empire alive. Evelyn had the seeds. She reached into the copper seed box and pulled out a tiny, hand-folded paper packet. It was yellowed with age, but inside were a dozen small, dark, crescent-shaped seeds, preserved perfectly by Beatrice's careful hands. Using a small stone mortar and pestle, Evelyn carefully crushed 3 of the seeds. The dry shells cracked with a satisfying, rhythmic sound. She added a few drops of distilled water, watching the liquid turn a deep, pale amber. She filtered the extract, then mixed it with her base organic solution. This was the complete formula. The soil shield, as it was always meant to be, prepared a fresh slide of the mutated fungus. Using a glass pipette, she drew a single drop of her complete, stabilized formula and let it fall onto the black spores in the petri dish. She leaned in, her eye pressed to the microscope. The reaction was immediate. The aggressive black needles of the fungus began to shudder. Under the microscopic lens, the cell walls of the superblight ruptured, spilling their dark contents as the organic solution neutralized the mutation. The fungus was literally dissolving, turning to water. Within 3 hours, the petri dish was clear, leaving only the healthy green plant cells of the grape leaf, vibrant and unharmed. Evelyn sat back, a profound, quiet triumph washing over her. Her mind had won. 35 years of exile, of being called a fraud and a failure by her own town and her own children, had not dulled her genius. It had only refined it. In her hands, in a tiny glass vial of pale amber liquid, she held the salvation of Greenvale's entire agricultural industry. She could save every vineyard, every farm, and every family that had once turned their backs on her. And at the exact same time, that very vial was the execution order for Arthur Pendelton's career. She had her weapon. It was time to use it. Handle makes noise, but a secret whispered in the right ear can bring down a dynasty. Evelyn did not go to the newspapers. She did not contact the television stations, and she did not make a scene on the streets of Greenvale. She knew how the world worked. She knew that a billionaire like Arthur Pendelton could buy the silence of any editor or journalist with a single phone call. To the public, she would just be an eccentric, bitter 72-year-old woman living in a forest, screaming about a 35-year-old grudge. Arthur's public relations machine would bury her in a matter of hours, as unstable and dangerous. No, she would not fight him with noise. She would fight him with leverage. She would target the only thing Arthur's masters actually cared about: their money. Through a contact in the local Valley Registry, a retired clerk who still remembered her late husband with deep respect, Evelyn learned that 5 of the largest institutional shareholders of Greenvale Agrosystems had secretly arrived in the valley. They were the silent power behind the agricultural conglomerate that had just bought her family land. Now, they were staying at the exclusive, highly secluded Creek Lodge, hidden away from the prying eyes of the media. They were terrified. The rapid, catastrophic spread of the mutated superblight was no longer a rumor they could ignore. Their multi-million-dollar investments were literally rotting in the fields. They had come to Greenvale to demand answers from Pendelton, and Arthur was running out of lies to tell them. Evelyn sat at her wooden workbench, her gaze cool and calculating. She prepared 5 small cardboard boxes. Inside each, she carefully nestled a small glass vial containing a cutting of a grapevine. The leaves were vibrant, deep green, and perfectly healthy, despite the fact that she had personally inoculated them with the mutated fungus 3 days ago. Next to the vial, she placed a simple, handwritten note on thick, cream-colored paper. The note was brief. It was a masterpiece of psychological leverage. "You are looking for a solution to the crisis that will destroy your stock on Monday morning," it read. "Come to the old stone greenhouse at the forest edge this Saturday at 6 p.m. Arthur Pendelton is lying to you." She sealed the boxes. She did not use the local mail. Instead, she paid a young local courier, a quiet boy from the valley who rode a battered dirt bike and knew every back road, to deliver the packages. She instructed him to bypass the main lobby of the Oak Creek Lodge and hand-deliver the boxes directly to the shareholders' private villa suites, ensuring Arthur's corporate security team would never see them. The boy took the cash, nodded, and disappeared into the autumn fog. The trap was set. Evelyn returned to her stone greenhouse. She spent the next 2 days preparing her battlefield. She cleaned the space with meticulous care, sweeping away the dust of weeds, organizing her glass beakers, and arranging Beatrice's botanical journals on the workbench. She placed her vintage brass microscope in the center, flanked by the healthy green test subjects and the petri dishes containing the neutralized fungus. She wanted the greenhouse to look exactly like what it was, a sanctuary of absolute, undeniable scientific truth. She waited. The silence of the forest was thick, almost suffocating as Saturday arrived. The autumn air grew cold. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the stone floor of the greenhouse. 5:45 p.m. Evelyn sat on her wooden stool, her hands clasped in her lap, wearing her clean, dark woolen coat. Her breathing was slow and even. She knew the power of fear, and she knew the power of greed. She knew that when a billionaire's empire begins to rot, the rats are the first to look for a way out. They would come. She closed her eyes and listened to the quiet rustle of the wind through the pines, waiting for the sound of approaching car engines. A liar can run for 35 years, but he can never outrun the very soil he trampled. Exactly at 6 o'clock, headlights cut through black forest. The low, heavy rumble of 3 luxury SUVs approached, their tires crunching slowly over the wet gravel of the long, overgrown path. Evelyn did not move from her wooden stool. The heavy oak door of the greenhouse groaned open, and 5 figures stepped inside, their expensive cashmere and tailored wool coats brushing against the rough, mossy stone doorframe. They looked entirely out of place in the damp, ancient room, their polished leather shoes sinking into the soft dirt floor. They were quiet, nervous, clutching the small cardboard boxes she had sent them like lifelines. The door was slammed open with a violent crash. Arthur Pendelton rushed in, breathless, his chest heaving beneath his bespoke suit. His silver hair, usually so meticulously coiffed, was disheveled by the wind, and his eyes were wild with a mixture of raw fury and absolute, suffocating panic. He had been alerted by one of the shareholders' assistants, and he had driven like a madman to get here, his tires screaming on the mountain roads. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur roared, pointing a trembling, manic finger at Evelyn. "What are you doing here with this crazy old woman?" "Peter. She is a disgraced eco-terrorist. She has been obsessed with ruining my reputation for 35 years. Security, get her out of here immediately." Evelyn did not flinch. She did not even blink. Slowly, she adjusted the wick of the kerosene lamp, casting a steady, warm amber glow over her workbench, illuminating the green vine cutting and the old leather journals. "The security guards are at the main gate, Arthur," she said, her voice cool, quiet, and absolutely level. "They don't have jurisdiction in this forest, and these gentlemen did not come here to listen to you scream." Her gaze back to the 5 shareholders, ignoring Arthur completely. "Look," she whispered, gesturing to the vintage brass microscope. The lead shareholder, a stern, gray-haired man named Henderson, stepped forward. He looked out of place in his $1,000 coat, but his eyes were sharp. He leaned down and pressed his eye to the microscope. "Arthur told you the superblight is a localized irrigation issue," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the damp silence of the room. "He told you his chemical treatments will solve it if you just invest more capital. He is lying." Mutated because his patented formula, the one he stole from my laboratory in 1991, was incomplete. It was a temporary chemical plaster on a deep wound. The soil has rejected his lie. Henderson raised his head from the lens, his expression hardening into stone as he turned his gaze to Arthur. "The fungus in that dish is dead, Arthur," Henderson said, his voice dropping an octave. "And the vine is completely healthy. Explain that." She's using banned substances. She's poisoning them to make it look like a cure," Arthur stammered, sweat breaking out along his hairline, polished facade cracking and peeling away before their eyes. "Don't listen to her," Evelyn picked up 5 leather-bound folders from her workbench and handed them to the investors. "Inside those folders," Evelyn said, "you will find the comparative chemical analysis of my grandmother's 1991 journals and Arthur's original patent. You will find the proof that his entire multi-billion-dollar empire is built on a stolen, unstable draft. More importantly, you will find the audited data of his current falsifications. He has been doctoring satellite crop reports and lying to the SEC to protect his stock price before the harvest inspection." Arthur lunged toward the workbench, his fingers clawing for the folders, but Henderson stepped in his way, his heavy arms solid and unyielding. "Evelyn, this is absurd," Arthur hissed, his voice cracking as he backed away, cornered against the stone wall. "This is blackmail. You have nothing." "It is not blackmail, Arthur. It is a hostile takeover," Evelyn replied, her eyes narrowing to cold slits. She looked at the shareholders. "On Monday morning, you have 2 choices. Option 1, you fire Arthur Pendelton for gross scientific fraud of his board seat and transfer his personal 40% stake in Greenvale Agrosystems to my family's ancestral trust. In return, I will give you the completed, stabilized formula. Your vineyards will live. Your stock will rise." She paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the greenhouse settle over them like a shroud. Option 2. You protect him, and at 8 a.m. on Monday, the original journals, the proof of the 1991 theft, and the data of Arthur's current SEC violations will be delivered to the Federal Trade Commission and the national press. Your stock will crash by noon. Choose. Arthur looked at the shareholders, his face turning an ash gray. "Henderson, Peter, listen to me. She's bluffing. You can't trust her. We've been partners for decades." Henderson did not even look at him. He closed his folder, slid it under his arm, and looked at Evelyn with a cold, professional respect. "We will have the transfer papers ready by midnight, Ms. Sullivan," Henderson said quietly. "The board will vote on Pendelton's termination first thing in the morning." Arthur collapsed back against the stone wall, his mouth open but silent, his breathing shallow. Finished. 35 years of stolen glory, gone in a single, quiet evening in a damp stone room. Evelyn stood tall, the queen of her sanctuary, watching her enemy fall without having to raise her voice once. The earth does not rush its seasons, and neither does a long-awaited justice. Within a month of that quiet Saturday evening in the forest, the Pendelton name had become a curse in the valley of Greenvale. Arthur Pendelton was stripped of his titles and his board seat, his personal assets frozen as federal prosecutors built an ironclad case of corporate fraud, environmental and illegal market manipulation against him. He was a ruined man, confined to his home, awaiting a trial he could not buy his way out of. Meanwhile, the board of Greenvale Agrosystems acted with cold, clinical speed. They accepted Evelyn's terms without a single whisper of protest. By the time the first winter snow began to fall, 40% of the conglomerate's shares, along with the legal deeds to her family's ancestral estate, were officially transferred to her family trust. Evelyn was now the majority owner of the very company that had tried to erase her. The first executive order was not made from a high-rise boardroom. It was written by her own hand at her old wooden workbench in the stone greenhouse. She ordered the immediate shutdown of the chemical processing plants. The smokestacks that had poisoned the air of Greenvale for 35 years went cold. Evelyn hired local organic agricultural scientists to begin the slow, arduous process of detoxifying the soil, dismantling the industrial grapevines, and converting the sterile commercial fields back into natural, organic, botanical sanctuaries. Step by step, the concrete was broken. Earth was allowed to breathe again. She rebuilt Beatrice's apothecary gardens, planting lavender, sage, and wild roses where the chemical barrels had once been buried. Then came her children. David, Clara, and Mark arrived at her newly rebuilt cottage on a bright spring morning. They did not wear their arrogant corporate smiles. They looked small, humiliated. David's hands shook as he offered her a bouquet of flowers, his voice thick with rehearsed apologies about terrible misunderstandings and doing what they thought was best for her health. But Evelyn could see the calculation in her eyes. They knew she was now a very wealthy woman. They were looking for their share of the inheritance. Evelyn stood on her porch, looking down at them. Her voice was quiet, but it had the weight of iron. "I will not buy your affection," she said, cutting through David's excuses, "and I will not fund your comfortable lives with the money born of my grandmother's sacrifice. There will be no payouts, no trust funds, no easy inheritance." The children gasped, looking at each other in shock. "If you want to be a part of this family," Evelyn continued, "you will work for it. Hiring field hands for the new organic vineyards, minimum wage, long hours in the sun, no voting rights in the company, and no special treatment. If you want to learn who I am, you will start by learning to respect the dirt you tried to sell." To her quiet satisfaction, they did not walk away. The shame of public exposure was too great, and the silent debt they owed her was too heavy. By Monday, her children were in the fields, their soft, manicured hands learning the bitter, honest sting of physical labor under the watchful eyes of her managers. Months later, the sun was setting over the hills of Greenvale, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and violet. The air was sweet again, heavy with the clean, sharp scent of lavender and fresh-cut rosemary. Evelyn, now 73, stood in the center of her rebuilt garden. Her heart was light. Beside her was Lily, her 9-year-old granddaughter. Lily had her grandmother Beatrice's curious, bright eyes. Evelyn knelt in the rich, dark soil, her old, scarred hands gently guiding Lily's small fingers toward a blooming lavender stalk. "Hey, sweetheart," Evelyn whispered, showing her how to rub the dried flower heads to release the tiny, dark seeds. "Never rush the harvest. Patience is the first lesson of the soil." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old copper seed box, its metal now polished and gleaming in the warm sunset, the secret fern leaf latch fully open. She placed it in Lily's small hands. "This belongs to you now," Evelyn said softly. "It is a reminder of where you come from. It is a story about why truth and dignity matter more than anything else in this world. Never let anyone take them from you." She smiled, holding the box tightly to her chest. Evelyn looked out over her blooming green gardens, knowing that the cycle of her family's trauma was finally, beautifully closed, and the truth had finally come home to stay.